So what we're going to do today is just touch ever so briefly in many ways on the Sermon on the Mount. As you can see by the pile of Hermania volumes and other things down the front, it's an absolutely massive subject. We could easily have a semester course subject just on Sermon on the Mount and you wouldn't get through everything. So that presents an interesting challenge in terms of an hour and a half presentation. So anyway, those of you that have been online and downloaded the handout know where I'm basically heading. So I'm starting a course on Mount Beatitudes, looking down over the Sea of Galilee, and some of you will know that place. I think that's actually a shot from last year, maybe the year before. But we're certainly dealing with a sort of classic text as we get into Sermon on the Mount. So let's have a look at this. And of course, we're dealing with the version, specifically the version in Matthew chapters 5, 6 and 7, which is the Sermon on the Mount. But we also have a parallel but shorter version of more or less the same core material in Luke chapter 6, and so it's become known as the Sermon on the Plain because it wasn't on the Mount. And he actually says at one stage he'd come down on the plain and he spoke to the people and so on. Behind it probably lies, as we'll discuss briefly, the sermon in Q, and of course Q has a number of discourses or sermons. Indeed, Q is itself, in the opinion of people like John Kloppenborg, is really a collection of 6 sermons, 6 sets of sort of prophetic speeches, and one of those, Q6, because it's based on Luke's numbering, is the earlier form, the pre-Matthean form of the Sermon on the Mount. And it raises the question whether we're actually dealing here with what in the material from, say, referenced by, say, Papias in the 2nd century, but only quoted by Eusebius in the 4th century, whether what we're dealing with here are the so-called logia, or sayings of the Lord, which Matthew wrote in Hebrew, da-da-da-da-da. And again, these are not Hebrew compositions, it's a Greek text, but are these the traditional sayings of Jesus? So this is a quote from Betts's, in fact 1992, so this is Betts in the Anchor Bible Dictionary. Sermon on the Mount, hereafter SM, not only designates the particular text in Matthew, chapters 5, 6, 7, but for the public mind, and especially in the present debate, stands also for the text that sums up the uncompromising ethics of the historical Jesus, as distinct from the post-Easter theology of the Christian church. So, in the eyes of... Is that too many words for you?
Yeah, just trying to keep up with you.
Okay, you want to dot points? In other words, in the popular mind, and we'll see this in a moment, the Sermon on the Mount is the essential Jesus, the quintessential Jesus, the pure Jesus before the Christians got at him and turned him into Christ. That's what's being said there, okay? That if we really want the guts of what Jesus was on about before all this Christological stuff got wrapped around him, you'll find it in the Sermon on the Mount and similar material. So Sermon on the Mount is like code for the sayings of the historical Jesus, and another version of that is the reds and pinks from the Jesus Seminar. The core teaching material of Jesus. That's what gets sort of Dom Crossan excited. That's what lots of people in the wider public, if they may not have much time for Catholics or Anglicans or the church, but they still have an interest in what Jesus said. Well, that's the Sermon on the Mount. Now, of course, there's other stuff. So what Betts is saying is it's, strictly speaking, it's Matthew 5 to 7, but in the popular mind and in some historical Jesus reconstructions, the sayings of Jesus that are authentic, as distinct from the inauthentic ones, are the essence of Jesus. We'll come back to that idea as well. So if you do a Google search, as of course you do when you're starting to get ready for a lecture, you immediately come up, if you do a search on Sermon on the Mount, 1.3 million results in 0.24 seconds. So there's lots of stuff out there, most of which of course is best left out there and not used. But it was interesting just to see, and if I had a little bit more time, there's a wish, I of course would have brought in The Life of Brian, and we could have watched Blessed Are the Cheesemakers, but some of us can probably recite it off anyway, and because it's being video recorded, I wasn't sure how the copyright stuff would go with YouTube, so you can just sort of do the blessed are the cheesemakers at coffee break or something. Okay, so I want to just quickly highlight some of the cultural and religious significance of the Sermon on the Mount. And in some people's imagination, this is what St. Augustine of Hippo looks like. Okay, probably not anymore, but once upon a time, it's obviously a stained glass window. So what we're dealing with in the Sermon on the Mount is a text with many afterlives. Okay, it's influenced many more people. So if in the case of Augustine, he's somebody basically around the year 400, he would have been at his peak. Okay, he would have been about 40 years old at that stage, and he lived another 30 years. A fascinating guy in his own right, and so hugely influential. And he actually wrote the first ever commentary on the Sermon on the Mount as a distinct literary piece. Indeed, he gave it the name Sermon on the Mount. Sermon Domini in Monte. Okay, the Sermon of the Lord on the Mountain. Okay, so the Sermon on the Mount. That branding of this material in Matthew's Gospel comes from St. Augustine. Okay, and his work on which was, as I said, it was written just before 400, 392, 396 is the kind of date range that people suggest. That was hugely influential for the next 1,000 years in terms of, and people really didn't advance much beyond what, Augustine was doing. And on the way in this morning, Eve was checking on her iPad to see what the library held on the Sermon on the Mount. And I said, "Oh, you probably got a first edition of St. Augustine," but knowing our library. And no, we don't have a first edition, but we do have a copy, a translation of Augustine's Sermon on the Mount in the Ancient Christian Writers series, volume 5, if you're interested. Jumping forward 1,000 years, we of course come to Martin Luther, who again, interesting story here. Towards the end of his life, he was doing some relief work, filling in for a Lutheran pastor who'd gone further north to sort of push the boundaries against the dreaded Catholics. And so while he was filling in this parish, he did a series of weekday sermons on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, 7, which his students listened to very carefully. This was something Eve again thought I should emphasise for you this morning. They listened very carefully to his lectures and then published them afterwards. And then he wrote a sort of preface, but he wasn't particularly happy. He didn't feel it was a scholarly piece of work. And in that, he's very much focusing on ethics and discipleship and drawing on the Sermon on the Mount as he does that. Okay. Much more closer to home, of course, we've got the amazing example of Albert Schweitzer, who was something like 1875 to 1965. So he died at the age of 90. An amazing guy, a theologian, a musician, and also a medical doctor. And he really focused on the Sermon on the Mount as an interim ethic. His view of the Sermon on the Mount was that it was part of the apocalyptic eschatological message of his Don Quixote type of Jesus, but it wasn't intended to be an ongoing thing. These were sort of special regulations for that interim period between the appearance of Jesus and the arrival of the kingdom. So roll up your sleeves, let's make a special effort. We're going to live like this till the kingdom comes, which will be soon, so we'll be able to manage it. So it was an interim ethic. He, of course, took the view that Jesus ultimately was wrong, since the kingdom didn't come, and therefore the interim ethics are not applicable to us, and he eventually went on to develop his own sense of ethics, which inspired his own decades of ministry in Africa with the reverence for life kind of ethics that he developed. But he's certainly one of the major 20th century interpreters of the Sermon on the Mount, and in many ways he's the kind of heroic individual that many people would see as sort of embodying the best of the Sermon on the Mount. Then there's Mahatma Gandhi. Okay? This is a quote from him, and it's too many words in a row, so I'll read it out for Daniel's sake. Okay? The message of Jesus, as I understand it, is contained in the Sermon on the Mount, unadulterated and taken as a whole. If If I had to face only the Sermon on the Mount and my own interpretation of it, in other words, without all the theological stuff, I would not hesitate to say, oh yes, I'm a Christian. But negatively, I can tell you that in my humble opinion, what passes as Christianity is a negation of the Sermon on the Mount. I'm speaking of the Christian belief, of Christianity as it is understood in the West. Another place, that's his comments, particularly on the sermon. Another place he says, he has a lot of affection, a lot of respect for Jesus, for Christ, doesn't think much of Christians. Okay, so part of what's going on with the Sermon on the Mount is, it's got a life of its own beyond Christianity, as the sort of epitome, the essence of what Jesus was about and the church should be about. And that so invites us, it's one of those few bits of scripture which is kind of escape from the playground and it's part of the common cultural legacy of humanity kind of thing. Similarly, quite different, but also in a similar way in terms of taking it very seriously, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German martyr towards the end of the Nazi period in Germany, in Europe, he drew on the Sermon on the Mount for his little book, The Cost of Discipleship, which was a major classic and still a very powerful, influential document. And he basically was calling on, he was contrary to Schweitzer, who of course he would have known, he was saying, no, this is not an interim ethic, this is how we are required to live right now, and it is possible to do. It's called religionless Christianity, it's called costly discipleship, it's costly grace, it's not cheap grace, and there's a whole lot of fantastic quotes. If you just Google Bonhoeffer Sermon on the Mount quotes, you'll get pages and pages and pages of quotes from Bonhoeffer dealing with the Sermon on the Mount. Then, of course, there's Martin Luther King, who often, this is an extract from the National Council of Churches in the USA website. Dr. King often pointed out that it was Jesus' Sermon on the Mount that inspired the dignified social action of the civil rights movement. His notion of creative suffering, borne by civil rights activists who endured persecution and police brutality, came from his Christian faith in the redemptive suffering of Jesus. So we've got actually two streams flowing through there. The Sermon on the Mount, which has no redemptive suffering element in it, and which is more the sort of passion story, and the focus on the ethical demands, the ethical teaching we find in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, so we've got from Augustine to Martin Luther to Albert Schweitzer to Dietrich Bonhoeffer to Mahatma Gandhi, down to Martin Luther King. We've got a raft of major characters that have been inspired by their engagement with the Sermon on the Mount. So it leaves hanging the question, did Jesus have anything to do with the Sermon on the Mount? It's a classic speech, it's attributed to him. Who was the speechwriter? Who was the guy with the Master of Communication degree that was actually writing this in the background? Okay. Who was it? Masters in journalism, not communication. Sorry, silly me. All right. So did Jesus ever deliver such a programmatic sermon? Would have been a good idea if he had, obviously. Would have been a bestseller. But yeah, did Jesus ever actually give this sermon? Now, the fact that we have a sort of shorter parallel version known as the Sermon on the Plain, or hereafter SP, okay, that basically excludes the likelihood that the Sermon on the Mount is the work of Jesus in its present form, because we've got two versions of the same speech, one much longer, one much shorter, and it's pretty clear Matthew has expanded Luke's version to create Matthew's version, even if it didn't come from Luke directly. That what we find in Luke is the first draft, and what we find in Matthew is a more elaborated version of the same essay, if you like. So what we have is not so much a single sermon event being remembered, but a sermon event being created in Matthew, just as in Luke we find him creating sermons for Jesus to give in the synagogue in Nazareth, and for Peter to give on the day of Pentecost, and for Paul to give in Athens, and so on. This is what an ancient storyteller, of course, had to do. So most likely what we have is a traditional collection, even earlier than the Gospels, and traditional collection of Jesus materials that combine material from various historical occasions, as well as supplementing it with other material. And part of the wild card in all this, of course, as we know from the Pauline epistles, is that at any point in the early church someone could stand up and say, I have a word from the Lord. and they could provide a new oracle, as Paul does in 1 Corinthians 7. Okay? And that's going to be just as valued and just as respected in the community of faith as somebody saying, I remember that Jesus once said, da-da-da-da-da. To us that has more credence as a historical memory of something Jesus really did, whereas a claim that Jesus or the Spirit has given me a word from Jesus, that's too intangible for us. And so we actually trust, as Westerners, we're more inclined to trust the memory of something that was once said than somebody saying, I've got a word from the Lord and what he wants us to do is whatever. Okay? We privilege the historical material and we discount the religious, direct prophetic revelatory material. So in the ongoing Jesus tradition, some of the words that Jesus said would have been remembered words that he passed his lips, although not in Greek, and some of the words that are Jesus' words would have been things that prophets within the community said, this is a word from the Lord, from the risen one who's here amongst us. Just as much a word of the Lord as something remembered from the shores of Lake Galilee. But the historian can't deal with prophetic oracles. That's a different category of information. Okay. So we probably have a bit of all of that in what we now call the Sermon on the Mount. So it's been remembered, it's been collected, and it's been supplemented by Jesus' followers. Okay, and of course one of the challenges then becomes, do we focus on the Jesus of the sermon, in other words, take the canonical form of this text and translate, interpret, deal with that, or do we try to focus on the hypothetical reconstruction of the sayings of Jesus which lie behind the sermon? Okay, and there's benefit in both, and we just simply had to make a choice as to what we're doing at different times and be conscious that they're not the same thing. Okay. Similarly, there's a Paul, there's a figure of Paul, sort of canonical Paul. That's the Paul we hear about in church and the Paul we learn about in Sunday school. Okay, that's not the historical Paul. It's not the Paul of Romans. It's the aggregate picture of Paul that we get from from all the New Testament documents, and even the way the church has canonized and respected and engaged with Paul over 2,000 years. That creates a persona of Paul, okay, which impacts on the life of the church. That's different from trying to reconstruct the life story of Paul of Tarsus, which is a different, worthwhile task, but a different task. You with us, Karen? You're frowning and furrowing I can see you're processing and what's he doing to me? How's he messing with my head this week? Okay, all right. That's my job, of course, is to mess with your heads and provoke you to go away and think. Okay, form your own opinions. Okay. So all of that would take us into, which we're not going to head down that track today, it would take us more into a quest for the historical Jesus and whether or not this verse or that verse was actually said by Jesus, okay, or preserves something that Jesus would actually have said. Hi, come on in. So let's look just very briefly at a kind of reception history, since we've sort of been doing reception history lately. Let's pick that up. In fact, this is something it's always been important to me to pay attention to, the history of interpretation, which is another way of talking about reception history. So we can assume that the origins of the sermon as we have it in Matthew lie in the Q Gospel, the Sayings Gospel Q, or some other similar collection of material. And so in a sense, Matthew and Luke are themselves examples of that material being received, okay, and interpreted and put to use in their Gospels. So it's not just a case of the reception history of Matthew's sermon, it's actually the sermon as we find it in Matthew. That's already one of the steps in its reception history, because Matthew has chosen to give it a prominence and a significance in his Gospel that Luke doesn't give it. And obviously Mark didn't give it. And interestingly, I think this is the next point, not even John deals with it. I mean, John's into speeches by Jesus, okay? But he doesn't have anything like the Sermon on the Mount. So we don't find any reception of the Sermon on the Mount material in the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of John, the letters of Paul, or even where we might expect to find it, the letter of James, which is kind of playing in the same sandpit. Okay? And the one place in the New Testament where we find references to the teachings of Jesus outside the Gospels is in the letter of James. But there's nothing like the Sermon on the Mount in the letter of James. So it's an uneven reception history within, if you like, the first 100 years or so. However, it probably underlies the so-called two ways material that we find in say, the Didache and the Epistle of Barnabas and a few other ancient early Christian sources. These are traditional catechetical materials which basically use the metaphor of two ways, the way that leads to life, the way that leads to death, the narrow way, the broad way, the good way, the bad way, all that sort of stuff. Okay. So come on in. We'll get up to a full quota. One more to go, I think, and we'll be fully there. No, you could each say, or maybe Chris can't say, but we can each say, I wasn't last. Okay. So that leads us into this idea that actually through the 2nd century down to around about 200, we're still dealing with a period where sayings material are actually the dominant version, the dominant medium, if you like, of the Jesus material. So I think it was Ignatius of Antioch who's actually on record as saying, I'm not interested in your writings, I want to know the logia, I want to know the sayings. Forget about the documents. Documents can be faked. I want to know the sayings. Because we have a totally different view of what counts as evidence for us. We're also 2,000 years down the track and we don't have access to living memory in the way that he did. But in that 2nd century, the Gospels were beginning to gain an acceptance, and certainly by 200 you've got the sort of Chester Beatty, P45, P46 and so on. So we've got clear evidence that the Gospels are emerging. Irenaeus is talking about 4 Gospels, 4 corners of the world, all that sort of stuff. So at the beginning of the 2nd century, it's all about oral tradition, and there are some written texts around. By the end of the 2nd century, it's all about the written texts, and there's a much more diminished opportunity for oral tradition and for the sayings tradition. So the sayings Gospels, whether it's the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Thomas, whatever, they all start falling out of favour as you get into the 3rd century. But they're big-time players in the 2nd century. So there's this kind of variable speed. So up till 200, sayings Gospels are a fairly common genre. After 200, it's all about narrative Gospels, and that basically comes down to Matthew, Mark and Luke. And because even John, in a sense, is a hybrid between a narrative Gospel and a sayings Gospel, because there's so much of the content of John are discourses. So we get to the commentary by St. Augustine that I mentioned at the beginning, round about 395, say, to go a midpoint between 392, 396. So just before the year 400, Augustine publishes this commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, and so it has now been received and acknowledged as a text with its own integrity, even though it's within the Gospel of Matthew. Okay? As has happened with the Lord's Prayer, say, which is part of the Sermon on the Mount, but the Lord's Prayer has its own tradition, history, okay, as a sacred text, a liturgical text, quite independently of the Sermon on the Mount. And then, of course, we've got the modern enthusiasm for the Sermon on the Mount that I started with, which is people from Albert Schweitzer to Dietrich Bonhoeffer to Mahatma Gandhi to Martin Luther King and so on, which is really sensing that actually this stuff really matters. In the Sermon on the Mount, we've got the guts of what Jesus was on about, as distinct from what the church is mostly on about. And there's this tension between the more theological framework of the church and the significance of the Sermon on the Mount. So that tension leads to these comments from Ulrich Lutz. When he's discussing, in his Hermeneia commentary, when he's discussing the reactions and the response to the Sermon on the Mount at the time of the Reformation, he points out that it was much more common, much more likely to be taken up by the Anabaptists than by the Lutherans or the Calvinists, because they wanted to bolt everything down. They didn't want the Pope, but they still wanted the church and the pastors to be in charge. Okay, so the more sort of radical Reformation movements, the Anabaptists, which some of you will be learning about in second semester next year when you do THL132, European Reformations, 1400 to 1700. The Anabaptists were the ones who the big street church kind of persecuted and tried to get rid of them, because they were actually taking this stuff way too seriously, way too literally, and it wasn't good for bishop stipends and pastor stipends if you go down that track. Okay. So Lutz notes that a real practice of Christianity based on the Sermon on the Mount never spread widely among the churches of the Reformation. They weren't going to go there. Okay? So not only do you have the question of whether Jesus would be welcome if he turned up in our church, do we even want to listen to his sermon? Okay? On one level we do, another level we don't. It's very confronting, it's very challenging. It's more likely to find a home in the Salvos, for instance, than at the cathedral. Or indeed some blogs by the swamp. Okay, it's not about everything staying the same, it's about challenging stuff. On the other hand, he also says, actually it's on the same page, as he gets to the end of his conversation, the attempt to domesticate the Sermon on the Mount has completely failed. Then that's sort of, there's a tension between those two observations. They're saying different things. And one reason that we haven't built, the fresh expression of church around the Sermon on the Mount is that we'd had to change too much. So, because we can't domesticate with the Sermon on the Mount and just make it something which supports what we do. Okay? God is not a house elf, to quote Harry Potter, or to misquote Harry Potter, and the Sermon on the Mount does not just lend itself to the kind of churches we have become. So there's this tension going on. So leave now if you still want to be ordained. No, there's tension here about how we deal with this stuff. Okay, so I want us to focus on the canonical form of the Sermon on the Mount as we find it in Matthew 5, 6, 7. We'll note the fact that there's a parallel version in Luke, and that will inform some of our ways that we imagine the origins of this material, but we're going to be focusing on the canonical form. Okay? We're going to be reading Matthew this semester, as you know, not some hypothetical Q text or whatever. So we note, as all the scholars do, that really the sermon has three major sections. Like a good essay, like an effective sermon, there's going to be some kind of introductory movement to kind of get people on board, indicate what the project is about, indicate the kind of general topic, themes, method that's going to be used, and then at the end there's going to need to be a section that wraps it up. So it is interesting that when people look at the Sermon on the Mount, it does appear to have that intentional structure. It's not simply a whole lot of parables or a whole lot of teaching constructions in a row that lack an introduction and conclusion, which in a sense you could say for Matthew 13. Okay, it's a collection of parables, but it's not a sermon. Whereas Matthew 5, 6, 7 looks more like an intentional literary structure than simply a collection. Yes, question, that'll give me time to drink my coffee.
Does that suggest anything about the Sermon on the Mount having a social setting on its own?
Oh, for sure. Ask another question because the coffee's not finished. But yes, no, I'm sure it does. If there is an intentional shaping of a complete sermon with an introduction, a body and a conclusion, Times New Roman, double line spacing, 12-point font, 300 words to a page kind of thing, then straight away you've got social location, both in terms of who has done the shaping of this and for what purpose, for what context, for what sits in Laban. What are we dealing with here? And there's something, is this something just done for the purpose of the gospel? Or is it actually a shaping which even predates the gospel? Okay, and is there any evidence of this in the parallel versions in Luke 6 and so on? Okay. So yeah, certainly raises some of those questions. Okay, and I'm going to come to a more detailed proposal by Ulrich Lutz shortly in terms of the structure of the sermon. The genre of the Sermon on the Mount, well, obviously it's a sermon. Well, actually, maybe not. I mean, Augustine calls it the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, but it's not a sermon. It's actually Jesus is sitting down teaching like a rabbi. He's not giving a sermon. Okay, he's providing instruction. So it's going to be in the broad genre of catechetical, didactic, teaching type material. It's not descriptive. It's not a parable. It's not a story. It's not a list. It's going to be more in the some kind of instructional kind of genre. So it's not, even though we call it the Sermon on the Mount, it's not actually a sermon, although it's shaped intentionally as a formal speech. It's possible we might want to understand it as being some sort of catechetical material for catechesis, for the instruction of converts. So although on paper it's addressed at the audience, it's really addressed at the readers who are followers. Okay, and it's the disciples and the people from the crowd who are choosing to listen to Jesus. They're the ones being instructed, the ones for whom the catechesis is being given. Betts suggests the category or the genre of, say, epitome. So that means what you're doing is you're taking a larger body of material and you're condensing it. I guess, I don't see them around much these. When I was a kid, I used to see a lot of the Reader's Digest condensed books, which don't give you the whole novel, but they give you a sort of condensation, an epitome, and it's done in such a way that you feel like you've read the whole book. It's not just an extract. It's a reducing, very careful copy editing to bring it down to a shorter thing, something that students might sometimes want to do. So it focuses on sort of brevity and being precise and accurate, and it aims to represent faithfully the larger work, not simply to give a sample of one portion of it. Okay, so in a sense epitome works well. That's one of the things that's going on here. So the kind of definition of, say, epitome in terms of Sermon on the Mount is this one again. This is from Betts's larger work. So in the case of the Hermaniah series, we've got 3 volumes on Matthew done by Lutz, but then you've also got this tiny little paperback by Betts, which is just on the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, except the Sermon on the Mount, it says Sermon on the Mount when you go inside a Sermon on the Mount /plain. It's actually a commentary on Matthew 5, 6, 7 as well as Luke 6, 20 to 49 or whatever. Okay, so but that speaks volumes. Bad pun, but I mean that speaks volumes about the significance. I got it. Have another coffee.
No, that's right.
I don't want to get your jokes, she says. I'm going off coffee. That says a lot about the significance of the Sermon on the Mount, that in a commentary series like Hermaniah, they actually bring out a special volume, just a thin thing, nothing very substantial, okay, on the Sermon on the Mount, as well as a 3-volume study on Matthew and other 1 or 2 volumes on Luke. We also get, and then there's also a set on say the Didache and the Epistle of Barnabas. So a lot of the same material is going to be discussed by different authors in those other literary contexts. But in this study, this is where Betts develops his stuff on the sermon as an epitome. So the literary genre of the Sermon on the Mount is that of an epitome, presenting the theology of Jesus in a systematic fashion. The epitome is a composition carefully designed out of the sayings of Jesus, grouped according to thematic points of doctrine considered to be of primary importance. Correspondingly, its function is to provide the disciple of Jesus with the necessary tool for becoming a Jesus theologian. Okay? That's cute. Hearing and doing the sayings of Jesus, therefore, means enabling the disciples to theologize creatively along the lines of the theology of the Master. Okay, so these are biblical scholars beginning to think theologically, okay, starting to kind of converge the separate disciplines. So it's, and I remember a couple of weeks ago we noted the point from Lutz that the significance of the 5 discourses in the Gospel of Matthew is that this is when Jesus gets to speak directly to the reader. Okay, in a sense, when Jesus is running in the place healing people and casting out demons and stuff, we're watching a video. But then when you get to the speeches, it's like we're the audience. Jesus is now speaking to us as 2nd century Antioch Christians or 21st century Brisbane Christians, rather than simply, oh, that's interesting, he said that. It's like we hear the sayings of Jesus as addressed to us, rather than simply, oh, so that's what he told that person in the story. The discourses function more like direct address to the reader. And it's much the same kind of point being made here. So what's going on in the sermon? What's the theme? What's the one sentence summary of the what's going on? Remember, certainly when I was a first year theological student at Boondall Church of Christ, the minister wouldn't let me in the pulpit to preach unless I could tell him in one sentence what my sermon was about. He said, if you can't put it in one sentence, how the hell are they going to get it and understand it? Okay, so I wasn't allowed to preach unless I could tell Phil Jauncey what my sermon was in one sentence. I also wasn't allowed to use...
I still did that with politicians.
Yeah, exactly. It's about effective communication. I wasn't allowed to use notes. I had to have the sermon worked out, but then I was not allowed to use notes, and I had to be able to say in one sentence what I was talking about, what my point was.
So how often did you get to preach?
Oh, several times a month.
Okay. Well, that's pretty good.
Were they all short sermons?
No, Church of Christ, they're not short sermons. They're substantial sermons. But Phil was all of 22 or 23, and he was the minister, and I was 18 and I was the student, so it was like, go for it, we can do stuff. So there you go, young people in ministry, dangerous. All right, so that was for you, Jane. Okay, so Lutz notes, this is back in his commentary now, that the Sermon on the Mount is the first extensive proclamation of Jesus that Matthew presents. Up until now, Jesus has almost been a third-party kind of topic. Now Jesus gets to actually take the microphone, as it were, and speak directly to the reader. So this is Jesus' first gig in terms of speaking to the reader. And the fact that it's here rather than later in the text means it's a foundational piece of writing. Yeah, sorry. Probably. We'll come to that. We'll get to that in a sec. Yeah, we're assuming that he's taken it over. He's inherited it, but he's also shaped it, because it's different from what we find in Luke, but sufficiently similar that we think there's some relationship. Yeah. So, but he's chosen where to put it. It's not something he got from Mark. So either he just knew about it, and we're not saying that he took it from Luke, but that both Luke and Matthew have this material which is in common, but it's in a more developed form in Matthew, and in Luke you get a chunk of it in chapter 6, and then some of the other bits of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount you find elsewhere in Luke, but not gathered into a single sermon. So if you took just that data, you'd say, well, Matthew and Luke agree, have a common source, which gives them something like Luke chapter 6, 20 to 40-ish. Matthew has also got that material, but some of the other stuff that Luke uses in other parts of his gospel, Matthew has used to make his new and enlarged version of the sermon. Now, this doesn't mean Matthew is using Luke. It's just that Matthew has, like Luke, Matthew has access to an earlier version of the Sermon on the Mount, as well as other material. And Matthew has actually, if you like, he's got extra quotes, and he's going to use them in his essay. Okay? So
do you actually know that there was, a Sermon on the Mount? Do we know that happened, like a time when... I think that was after you came in, but yeah, that was one of the points I raised. So what's the relation between Jesus and the sermon?
did he actually preach a big sermon event on top of a mountain? Well, no. Okay. No more than Moses went up and down the Mount Sinai umpteen dozen times carrying lumps of stone so God could carve the 10 Commandments on them. These are stories the Bible tells us to give us a big moment.
Are a number of known discourses, sayings, sermons, whatever, that Matthew and Luke have known about or have sourced and have treated differently, in that Matthew might bring them all together in one great big thing and Luke might sprinkle them around a bit more? Basically,
the gospel. The big theory is that in the what's the phrase for it? The tradition history of the synoptics, okay, of the gospel. So Mark tells us that Jesus went around everywhere teaching, but he doesn't tell us what he said. Now that of course just begs for the tradition to provide the content. I mean, that's what happens with the Old Testament. If the Old Testament says something happened, but it doesn't give you the detail, that in the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, Jewish religious thinkers generate texts which fill the gaps in the Old Testament. In a sense, Mark leaves gaps. He says Jesus was using parables, doing this, doing that, talking to the crowd, but he doesn't give us lots of examples. So in the Q, what we call the Q material, we get the content. Jesus' speech notes, if you like. Not that he had speech notes, but I mean, this is the kind of, we've found the record of what he said, as it were. Now, in the case of the Q Gospel, one of the big breakthroughs, and it was people like John Kloppenborg did this, he noticed that really the material that we think is Q actually can be understood as 6 great speeches by the Jesus people as they go around preaching and so on. Now, one of those speeches is basically Q6, which is Luke 6. And that's the sermon. That's the Sermon on the Mount, or the Sermon on the Plain. There's another one is say the mission charge, Jesus sending the disciples out. Another one is the eschatological discourse, and so on. So you get different speeches or discourses in Q. Now, what has happened either by Matthew or by the time it gets to Matthew is that in the Matthean churches, the traditional sermon of Jesus, where he gives lots of instruction on Torah, has grown into what we call Matthew 5, 6 and 7. Whereas in the Lucan church, it's just Luke 6 verses 20 to 40. So one's about, Matthew's just over 100 verses, and Luke is only about 30 or 35 verses or something. So one is 3 times as long as the other. But most of the difference is material which does exist in Luke, but it's not part of the sermon in Luke. It's just odd bits and pieces in other parts of Luke. So in Matthew's tradition, they've been consolidated into one great sermon, and it's on top of a mountain, and so on. We'll come to that when we get to the commentary bit. Yeah. So what we've got here is this, like, Jesus' first big speech in Matthew is the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, it's going to be the speech in the synagogue in Nazareth. Okay? So you think about, so in the different Gospels, what's the first big thing Jesus does? And all 4 Gospels do it totally differently. Okay? So, which tells us, no, this is not the historical Jesus. This is people doing what we would expect a storyteller to do. Which I'm going to tell you the story this way, and I'm choosing to begin with the turning of the water into wine. Okay, it's the first big thing really in John's Gospel. Okay? And then I'm going to follow that, if I'm John, with the cleansing of the temple. Ooh, doesn't that belong at the other end of this? It's my story. I'll arrange the events the way I want. I don't care that Matthew, Mark and Luke all have that event in the last couple of days of Jesus' life. I'm putting it in chapter 2. Now that's what the Bible does. The church tries to ignore it and pretend that it doesn't happen and there's no raggedy bits, okay? But actually the Bible is a bit more wild than the way we let people experience it. We measure it out in safe doses, okay? Because we don't want to frighten the horses. So in the way Matthew tells the story, the big creative moment Come on in, Waldemar. The big creative moment is the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? So it's a foundational text. The other thing is, out of all the discourses that Matthew has, this is the only one which is basically made up of commandments. Okay, so think about it. The 5 discourses, 5, 6, 7, Sermon on the Mount we're dealing with. Chapter 10 is the mission charge, sending the disciples out, telling them not what to take, what not to take, go into a house, give the greeting of peace, da-da-da-da-da. Chapter 13 is the parables discourse. They're not commandments, they're parables. Chapter 18 is stories and instruction about the life of the church. And, if your brother offends, take him to go and talk to him one-to-one. If that doesn't take along a couple of witnesses. If that doesn't work, take him to the elders, sort out the difference. So it's regulations for and advice for running a church community, but it's very different material from the other stuff. And then the 5th discourse is the eschatological discourse, which is about the end of the world. So that's kind of a bigger, different it's a mix of apocalyptic teachings, prophecies, parables, and so on. Okay, so what we get in the Sermon on the Mount is a discourse which is basically made up of commandments and Torah type things. These are legal instructions about how we are to live, how we are to behave as disciples of Jesus. So Jesus doing the rabbi role. Lutz suggests that when at the end of the Gospel, Matthew has Jesus say, teaching them to observe everything that I have commanded you, that everything I have commanded you is the Sermon on the Mount, in the intention of the author. And again, he's on a mountain as he says that. Okay? He's only on a mountain 4 times in Matthew. We'll come to that. Maybe. It's in the handout anyway, if we don't. All right, and Lutz actually suggests that rather than being the Sermon on the Mount, he thinks a more appropriate title would be Discourse on the Righteousness of the Kingdom of Heaven. But I'm sorry, Sermon on the Mount's been out there since St. Augustine in 395, and there's already a title. But you can see what he's getting at. It's really about what's the sort of righteousness which is appropriate for the people who are going to be participants in the Kingdom of Heaven. Okay? And of course there's nothing in the Sermon on the Mount about believing in Jesus, his blood washing away our sins, any of the stuff the church is big on. Okay? None of that is in the Sermon on the Mount, which is why we get this thing about the tension between the simple, pure Jesus, inverted commas, of the Sermon on the Mount, and the heavily reworked, doctrinaire, dogmatic Jesus of the Christ of faith. And so a lot of people read the Sermon on the Mount because they like that kind of religion rather than the more religious expression of the Jesus tradition. Okay, that's just a cloud. I don't know if we can do this with Accordance software yet, but in some kinds of Bible software, once you've done a search for words that occur a certain number of times, you can just generate a cloud, of tag cloud, a theme cloud. So this is one that somebody's done off their other Bible software, and it's just picking up some of the common words in the Sermon on the Mount. So it's just another way to kind of notice data. Okay, we're presenting data visually rather than orally. Okay, which I do most of the time, orally that is. Okay, so it's a little moment just to let your brains relax. Okay, 5, 4, 3. Okay, that's enough relaxing.